Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. When Jango Fett was selected to be the template for the clone army, Darth Tyrannus most likely was excited about Fett's combat abilities. In Legends, the Jedi and the Mandalorians actually fought each other during the Battle of Galderaan. The group of Jedi were actually led by Count Dooku, and they were tricked into fighting Jango Fett's true Mandalorian faction. It was a devastating skirmish, and both sides suffered heavy losses. Jango Fett and his Mandalorians would be defeated, but not before Jango kills several Jedi with his bare hands. Dooku witnessed this, and I'm sure this is one of the main reasons why he chose Jango Fett's DNA for the clone army job. The Fett DNA had already been pre-screened for its ability to kill a Jedi. It was good at doing this, but capability wasn't just the only thing that the Kaminoans were looking for. They also wanted obedience. And so there was another factor with these clones that the Kaminoans really liked that helped them shape these troopers into exactly what they wanted them to be. Something that guaranteed that Order 66 would have probably been carried out even if the inhibitor chips never existed. And that factor, well, that's the clone trooper's age. You know, the clone army was not the most efficient military force in the galaxy. It was definitely one of the best, probably one of the highest quality military forces, but there were a lot of problems that Palpatine faced. For one, you weren't just taking young men who had been raised and fed and sheltered by a family for the first 18 years of their life. When you create clone soldiers, they have no real family, and so the government has to step in and nurture these clones until they're old enough to fight. That's 18 years of changing diapers, cleaning up throw up and poop, and of course keeping these little testosterone-filled vessels from killing each other or blowing themselves up. This is a huge challenge. I mean, find me something more dangerous than a large group of young men who are trained to kill things but have nothing to kill. Now, even though this entire project was secretly being paid for by the Sith, cost-cutting measures needed to be implemented so that the clone trooper product was at least somewhat economically feasible. And so the Kaminoans did something quite smart. They sped up the physical developmental time of a clone by 2 times, which meant that by the age of 9, a clone trooper was at least physically old enough to be considered an adult. This meant cutting costs and cutting developmental time, which was huge, and the soldier you get is more or less kind of like an adult. Their mind and personality, however, well, that's a whole nother issue. You can speed up a child's development in the Star Wars galaxy by targeting an individual's growth plates, their bones, their muscle mass, fill them up with hormones. I mean, have you been to a gym lately? Have you seen all these teenagers that look like full-grown men? I'm sure that's only creatine, it's just creatine. But the brain is something completely different. I mean, wisdom can only come from age and experience. Heck, with some personality types, wisdom's not even possible. And so no matter how much flash training you squeeze into a clone's head, they're still just learning skills, and not necessarily why they should use these skills or when they should use them. You know, the mind was by far the most difficult thing for the Kaminoan cloners to crack, especially the human mind. The Kaminoans had this big dilemma. They wanted to deploy an extremely ruthless and capable military that was also 100% obedient. The problem with that dynamic is usually individuals who are very obedient are also kind of followers. They're not very creative, and they don't tend to think outside the box, and being predictable on the battlefield, well, that's one of the easiest ways to get killed. And Jango Fett was actually anything but predictable. As a matter of fact, the Kaminoans were worried that the first few batches of his clones were going to be too unruly and impossible to control, which for the Kaminoans would have been a huge failure and a stain on their brand and species name. In Legends, the first batches of Fett clones were known as the Nol Ark and the Clone Commandos, and they were definitely a lot more individualistic than the rank-and-file clones, and they were terrifying in combat. The Nol Arks were great for infiltration, espionage, deep undercover work, and they preferred to work by themselves, just like the original Fett. The Commandos, on the other hand, were a bit more obedient and better at following orders, and they worked very well in small units of 4. Usually they were sent behind enemy lines and heavily outnumbered, and so teamwork and heavy firepower were very important for these groups. The Bad Batch were actually a modified version of your normal commando unit. It was really only in the regular rank-and-file clones that we see more obedient behavior and more willingness to follow orders, but even for those clones, after a few years of combat, they began to change. They became more independent-minded as well. And I guess the reality is the Kaminoan cloners had very little experience cloning humans. They simply didn't really understand us. I mean, they definitely understood our genetics after a while, but they didn't understand what it meant to be a human being. We're kind of annoyingly independent and at the same time very social and collective. It's an interesting mix. And so the clone troopers, well, they all became extremely diverse in their appearance and personality the second they were released into the wild. And many were able to shake their docile and obedient nature, and these clones would excel at engaging the enemy in creative and very unpredictable ways. The thing is, what kept the clones obedient wasn't their genetics, altered or not, but the unexpected side effect of the advanced aging. You see, the clones looked like full-grown men, but they were all mentally 9 years old when they were sent onto the massive battlefield of Geonosis and told to run directly at enemy fortifications with zero cover and more than a few clicks of open ground to cover. You know that sense of sadness you feel when you see a bunch of clones get mowed down like this? We're not just sad because we can relate to these clones and we, are rooting for them because they are technically the good guys in the Clone Wars. What's more important is that the clones themselves are super likable. They're very good-natured. They're very optimistic. They aren't covered in scars, the horrors of war. They don't curse. They're clean-cut, at least in the first few years. And they maintain a naively upbeat view of their role in the Clone Wars. And it's not because they were genetically altered to be like this. It's because they were essentially children when they were sent to war. And children are extremely easy to indoctrinate. And that's just how it goes. Children are terrific at absorbing information and skills. And while it might not be age appropriate, it's pretty easy for a 9-year-old clone to learn how to field strip a blaster and then put it back together while under distress. These clones at the age of 9 weren't learning math, history, well, maybe a little bit of history, but they were focused more on firing blasters, driving walkers, and coordinating fire on a target. It's really not the most complicated thing to teach someone, especially when they know nothing but war. Fighting in war was a clone cadet's identity. And entering a battle was big for these clones. It was as if they'd been training for a game all their lives, but they've never really been able to use any of their skills until the Battle of Geonosis. A good percentage of 9-year-old boys already are fascinated by war, destruction, guns, and all these other things, and so this is kind of like the perfect situation, the perfect brainwashing opportunity for these Kaminoans. All that patriotism the clones had, all their love for the Galactic Republic was indoctrinated into the clones' minds by the Kaminoan trainers and flash learning. These clones didn't know what the Republic actually was. They didn't know what democracy was, and if they did, they probably would have rebelled and demanded a vote within the Republic that they were defending with their lives. But they didn't, at least at first, and that's because children naturally trust authority, their parents, the elderly, their teachers. And so basically, you can take a child and easily shape their worldview at a young age and teach them whatever crazy ideology you want. Of course, there's always a good chance that when that child gets older and starts learning about the world themselves, they'll become extremely angry at all of the brainwashing and propaganda you've exposed them to. In our own world, underfunded and desperate militants all across the world utilize children in combat roles. It's estimated that there are at least 500,000 children fighting in conflicts all around the world, from African militias to anti-cartel patrols in Mexico. Now, I found an interesting quote here from a child soldier on a NGO website fighting child soldiering, and this young soldier is basically talking about what makes child soldiers so efficient and so desirable to have in your military force. Children, my dear brother, are the best fighters of the century. They have more energy than older people. They resist without feeling physical pain. Now, Lucian gets right to the crux of the matter. Yes, children are little balls of endless energy, that much is true, but children are so large enough to pick up a weapon and fire it in anger. And when a professional grown-up soldier sees a child soldier, they might hesitate to fire back. Plus, those kids are going to be smaller and harder to hit. What makes the situation even worse is that children are easy to manipulate. They haven't really developed a full understanding of the world like most adults have. Take a close look at a toddler or a young child. They're basically adults on drugs. They lack coordination, they lack social awareness or understanding of what's going on. Children don't really understand the concept of death fully until they're teenagers. Younger children are able to understand death to a certain degree. They understand that it's permanent and irreversible, but trying to understand how death could affect your daily life, that's something that children don't necessarily think about that much. But if suddenly you and all your brothers are told by your commanders that the greatest honor a clone could have was to give his life for the Republic, suddenly that suggestion makes death seem a lot less scary and almost desirable, especially if you can create a culture that worships death or sees death as a positive thing. Here in our own world, we have grown-ass men who believe that if they do horrific things in their current life, they'll be rewarded in the next one. So is it that strange to believe that children could believe that as well, or at least be brainwashed into believing this? You know, the thing is, life experience teaches you to fear death. It makes you respect it a bit more. Especially if you have witnessed or seen death firsthand, you become more methodical, more cautious, and careful. You start to think about your own mortality. That's what growing up will do to you. Now, I love this show, The Band of Brothers. It follows Easy Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne. It's all based on real stories, real events, real battles, real people during World War II in the European theater. Now, early on in the invasion of Normandy, we have the assault on Brecourt Manor. Sergeant Carwood Lipton would climb into a tree and use it as a firing position to hit soldiers in an enemy battery nearby. It's either in the book or in the interviews of the actual soldiers who the actors portray, but Lipton admits that this is a really dumb thing for him to do, and had he been more experienced, he probably would have never climbed up in that tree. I believe he did get a Bronze Star, though, for his bravery or stupidity, whatever you want to call it. And I'm sure a lot of you guys at home can relate to this. Maybe not directly, but we all have a younger, more hot-headed and dumber version of our male selves. And yes, it's something that affects men quite a lot. I mean, I'm surprised that so many of us have made it to adulthood, considering all the hormones and energy we had when we were in our teens. And it's not that young men want to die. That's a misconception. It's just that we don't fear death when we have all those hormones coursing through our bodies. That's why all the good football players I played with growing up learned how to hit and endure pain when they were young playing Pee Wee football. And that's because when you get older and you're wiser, you realize how dumb the sport can be, you know, like running full speed at someone and just trusting those pads to protect you. It's gonna be a lot harder to get a 20-year-old to do that when compared to a 10-year-old. This is why most military forces also conscript 18-year-olds and not 35-year-olds who already have a life, a worldview, maybe family and property that they want to protect. And that's an 18-year-old. Now imagine how easy it is to convince a bunch of 9-year-old clones who you've been brainwashing for 9 years, completely isolated from the rest of the galaxy. These guys literally don't have the capability to see the world in any other way than the way the Kaminoans wanted to present it. And it's also during these defining years of their lives that the Kaminoans carefully shape the identity of all the clones, so that they see themselves as soldiers first and foremost, and they also see the Republic as their family. You know, warlords here on Earth, they might use drugs to get their child soldiers addicted so that they won't run away, and so they become dependent on their warlord. But in Star Wars, these clones are even in a worse situation, believe it or not. They're not fed drugs for the fear that they will run away. The clones actually have no place to run away to. Their face is instantly recognizable to most people in the galaxy, and at the same time, they were kept isolated. Even during the war, it was one battlefield to the next, and all they saw in between generally were the insides of the Venator-class Star Destroyers they called home. The Kaminoans made every effort to make sure that the clones could not readjust to society. They couldn't just take normal jobs. They couldn't just run away to the Outer Rim and become a smuggler or a bounty hunter. Well, at least most of them couldn't. And so even if a clone believed that their existence was unfair and that this entire war thing wasn't for them, they really had no place to run. And if they left, they would not only be failing at the very task they were created to do, they not only failed themselves, they were also letting down their brothers, their family. They might as well be letting down their gods as well, which I guess was the Republic, Chancellor Palpatine. I mean, this is why very few clones actually defected. You have Cutler Quain, whose entire unit was killed and massacred like dogs. He didn't defect so much as become permanently MIA. Sergeant Slick is a more unique situation. He did defect, and he betrayed his men, but I believe Asajj Ventress probably messed with his mind using the Force somewhat to get this situation to occur. So the next time someone tells you, oh, the clone troopers were the most obedient soldiers in the galaxy, remind your friends that these soldiers were amazing because they most likely had the mental maturity of children. They've been brainwashed, fed propaganda, and believed that this was their purpose in life. These clones were completely committed to being soldiers. And unlike warlords here on Earth who prey on the impoverished or refugees or maybe just capture people to enlist into their military force, the Kaminoans did something even more messed up. They created millions of clones with no fathers, mothers, and therefore no state or representation. They essentially created the perfect slave, at least for the owners of the slaves. It was perfect. And I guess I've always wanted to see what would have happened had the clones been active for another 5 years. Let's say the Republic didn't collapse and the Kaminoans just kept on churning these clones out. What happens when these clones hit their teenage years and begin to rebel? What happens when they start to actually critically think about their situation in life? I've always believed that Order 66 came at the exact right time for Emperor Palpatine. Things were already falling apart. You had clones like Fives and Rex beginning to question everything. The cracks were beginning to show. More and more clones were getting upset by how they were treated. A lot of these clones were probably looking at their units and they realized just how decimated they were and all the new faces. The clones after Geonosis awoke into the crazy reality that their military officers, these Jedi, were completely inexperienced in commanding military forces in large set-piece battles. They had seen their brothers smashed into pieces running in the open, where their advanced training and tactics did them very little good. The Battle of Geonosis was a rude awakening for many. It also made a lot of clones distrust their leaders, the Republic, and this sense of distrust would only continue to grow as the war would go on. Now, all throughout Star Wars history, all throughout galactic culture, you kind of see this idea of using children in more mature roles, and this happens a lot. Now, if you take a look at the many factions in the Star Wars galaxy, you'll notice this mentality of get them young and brainwash them young all over the place. The Jedi Order, for instance, only recruited Force users who were infants. This way, they could get a blank slate on which they can push their own ideology onto. Ultimately, it's wrong to do this to children, not just because it's morally wrong, but when you teach children lies or try to push them towards a worldview that is very subjective, they might not be complex enough right now to understand. But eventually, when they get older, they will develop their own views based on their experiences and personalities, and they might reject the extreme views or actions that were forced upon them when they were younger. The usage of 9-year-old clone soldiers by the Galactic Republic was not just morally and ethically wrong, it was just also rationally a bad idea. I mean, every action has a reaction, and by exposing all these young men to so much violence and death, they were creating a ticking time bomb that they would have to eventually deal with. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy.